Our reading this morning is by Elizabeth Tarbox, The Teaching Bean. When I was a child, my stepmother gave me and my sister each a lima bean. She showed us how to dampen some blotting paper and line a jam jar with it, and how to place the bean carefully between the blotting paper and the jar. She told us to stand the jars on the windowsill in our bedroom and keep the blotting paper wet and watch to see what would happen. A little later, I took my bean out and polished it up with a bit of furniture polish. It was all shiny now and smelled much better than my sister's bean. In a few days, my sister's bean swelled and a strong white root pushed out of the bottom of the bean. My bean just sat there. A week later, my sister's bean sprouted a green shoot that forced its way up and out of the top of the jar. My bean did nothing, but began to look wrinkly. In another week, my sister's jar was full of roots and shoots, and the bean was ready to be planted. My bean shriveled up and fell to the bottom of the jar, and I threw it away. How often have I covered things with furniture polish to make them shiny, to make them smell better? How often in my life have I cared more about the way things looked and how they smelled rather than how they really were? I spent half a lifetime covering my feelings with the emotional equivalent of furniture polish, thinking that if I looked good and smelled good, the ache inside would go away. But spirits are not like beans, thank God. They may shrivel with neglect, but as long as life persists, there is the chance to wash off the polish and redeem the growing thing inside. Maybe you were watching Dan Harris on air with Diane Sawyer when he lost it on national television. It started out fine. "Good morning, Charlie and Diane. Thank you," he said in his best morning anchor voice, chipper yet authoritative. But then, right in the middle of the second voiceover, it hit. "Out of nowhere," he said, "I felt like I was being stabbed in the brain with raw animal fear. A paralytic wave of panic rolled up through my shoulders, over the top of my head, and then melted down the front of my face. The universe was collapsing in on me. My heart started to gallop. My mouth dried up. My palms oozed sweat. He was having a panic attack." As his words strayed further and further from those on the teleprompter, he said he could picture the woman who operated the machine tucked away in a corner of the studio. For a nanosecond, amid his inner hurricane of thoughts, he worried what she in particular was thinking. Harris tried to continue on, but it wasn't working. The words he was speaking no longer made sense. Did I mention that 5 million people were watching? So at the end of the voiceover, he cut the newscast short several full minutes before he was supposed to, barely managing to squeak out, "That does it for the news. We're going to go back now to Robin and Charlie." Of course, he meant to say Diane and Charlie. After that brief on-air meltdown, which felt like an eternity, Harris was left to get his racing heart back under control and his career back on track as colleagues and executives lost confidence in him. Harris's panic attack, it turned out, was related to the pressure of the newsroom, to post-traumatic stress disorder from coverage of war zones, and to his self-medication with alcohol and cocaine. Mistakes can be like quicksand. They can swallow us up if we stay too long with them. This was the risk for Dan Harris. If he focused too long on his TV embarrassment, if he couldn't move past it, it was going to ruin his career. If he didn't get sober, it was going to ruin his life. I remember a mistake I made once that was not easily forgiven by the person who called me out on it. Without the grace of her forgiveness, I couldn't figure out how to move on. How could I get over my mistake without it? So I didn't. I clung to the embarrassment and shame of my mistake in a sort of perpetual mea culpa until one day a wise man at my church stopped me in my tracks. Upon hearing my story, with its emphasis on not being forgiven, he said gently, "Yeah, but after a while, that deep sense of guilt becomes a little self-serving, doesn't it?" He was right, of course. Eventually, it becomes a little self-serving and then self-destructive, to remain mired in the moments of our own bad judgment or embarrassment. Staying there feels hard, but sometimes it's easier than the hard work it takes to move on and to learn something from that experience. We talk a lot in Unitarian Universalism about being on a spiritual journey. Well, a fundamental element of being on a spiritual journey, on any journey, is movement. As we journey toward being our best selves, we are called to move beyond our mistakes, not to set up camp in them. One way to move beyond our mistakes is simply to acknowledge them. Last year, Scientific American featured an article by Janet Stemwedel entitled "The Ethics of Admitting You Messed Up." She writes, "Part of any human endeavor is the potential for messing up. Humans make mistakes." So she offers 8 steps for addressing our mess-ups. The first is to acknowledge the harm. This needs to be the very first thing we do, she says. To admit we messed up, we have to recognize the mess with no qualifications. There it is. The second is to acknowledge what she calls the experiential report of the people you have harmed. If we're serious about sharing a world, which is what ethics is all about, she says, we need to take seriously what the people with whom we're sharing that world tell us about how they feel. They have privileged access to their own lived experiences, and we need to rely on their testimony. Number 4, saying you are sorry comes with a little warning. Don't say, "I'm sorry if you were offended." This, she reminds us, is not actually apologizing. Number 7 is a little harder. 7, don't demand forgiveness. Some harms hurt for a long time. Trust takes longer to establish than to destroy, and rebuilding it can take even longer. Sometimes forgiveness will never come, but that shouldn't paralyze us. Addressing a mistake is not like winning an argument, Stemwedel concludes. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It's identifying a way that what you did wasn't successful or defensible or good. I think this is where many of us get hung up. We want to get back to feeling good about ourselves. And when there is no apparent resolution of a messy situation, when we haven't been able to talk ourselves out of it, or successfully gain forgiveness, or erase what happened, we have trouble moving on. That's when we can turn to our spiritual life to help. Sometimes we forget that we have this entire toolkit at our disposal to use during these messy moments. Take, for example, our opening hymn this morning. I brought my spirit to the sea. I stood upon the shore. I gazed upon infinity. I heard the waters roar. And then there came a sense of peace. Some whisper calmed my soul. Some ancient ministry of stars had made my spirit whole. I brought my spirit to the trees that loomed against the sky. I touched each wandering, careless breeze to know if God was nigh. And then I felt an inner flame that fiercely burned my tears. Upright I rose from bended knee to meet the asking years. Here on Cape Cod, we have a spiritual balm at our fingertips, the ocean. Standing beside the ocean always seems to help. There's something about feeling so small at the edge of something so big that puts things in perspective. Even our mistakes that unchecked can grow until they seem larger than life, shrink down to size at the water's edge. And there's something about the endless pull of the tides that serves to pull us back to living. As the waves crash to their own unpredictable rhythms, they wash away some of whatever is keeping us stuck. It is right to repent, to ask forgiveness, to get down on bended knee in supplication even, or in the solitude of prayer. Our faith often calls us to do this, but it doesn't call us to stay there. Our faith calls us to rise from bended knee, to meet the asking years, to move on from our moments of weakness, to move on from our guilt, to move on from our shame, to move on from our solitude into the company of others, to risk again being in relationship, messy, tangled, unpredictable relationship in which mistakes are inevitable, but not the end of the world. It was an unlikely turn of events that gave the skeptical and cynical news anchor Dan Harris the tools he needed to get past his on-air meltdown. Assigned the undesirable religion beat for ABC, Harris was forced to go on the road to interview televangelists, youth group leaders, ardent atheists, and inspired yogis as part of a Religion in America series. At first on assignment only, but then out of a real sense of seeking himself, Harris delved into a world of spiritual gurus, religious superstars, and a growing stack of self-help books, which eventually led him to meditation. He chronicles his story in his new book, 10% Happier: How I Tamed the Voice in My Head, Reduced Stress Without Losing My Edge, and Found Self-Help That Actually Works, a True Story. Harris speaks of self-help instead of spirituality, but that's fine. It takes a while for a cynic to warm up to churchy language. But meditation became a saving grace for him. Each meditation session offered practice in forgiveness and moving on. As each thought reared its head, Harris had the choice of staying with it or moving past it. At first, he couldn't stay with the breath for more than 4 counts. I knew I was supposed to just forgive myself, he writes, but I found that to be extremely difficult. Every time I got lost in thought, I went into a mini shame spiral. My wanderings were so banal. Is this really what I was thinking about all the time? Lunch? Whether I needed a haircut? My unresolved anger at the Academy for awarding the Best Picture to Dances with Wolves instead of Goodfellas? But eventually, he got the hang of it. He allowed his thoughts to arise and then let them go. His sits became longer and longer as he worked them into a daily practice. Pretty quickly, my efforts began to bear fruit off the cushion, he says in his book. I started to be able to use the breath to jolt myself back to the present moment in airport security lines, waiting for elevators, you name it. And I was much better at forgiving myself out in the real world than while actually meditating. Every moment was an opportunity for a do-over, a million mulligans. At times, moving on is about apologizing. At times, it's about making it up to someone. But sometimes it's just about not making that mistake what defines the rest of your life. Sometimes it means moving on in order to pledge your life to something other than guilt and shame, to something that is more life-giving. A few years ago, I heard this story on the radio as part of the StoryCorps project. A severe drought had parched huge swaths of the United States that year, a trend that has unfortunately continued. With so much scorched land, the center of the country was a tinderbox, and severe wildfires raged across several states. In 10 of those states, including Wyoming, the fires were being fought, at least in part, by teams of prison inmates. Daniel Ross was part of one of those teams. He's a former crystal meth addict, currently serving a 17 to 50-year sentence for aggravated assault against a Wyoming police officer. Ross remembers his first experience with firefighting. That first night, we were just dripping sweat, he says. Can't see nothing. Coughing, eyes are all watering. And these trees just exploding in front of me. I was horrified. Ross says fighting fires is one of the hardest things he's ever done, but that the risks are all worth it. When we go out on the fires, people treat you different, says Ross. Even if they do know you're an inmate, all they see is a hardworking person that's helping them, and it feels great. He tells the story of when his crew was dispatched to help the southern Wyoming town of Saratoga. At the end of our stay, townspeople wanted to donate us a prime rib dinner, he says. Now, we don't get prime rib very much here in prison, and I'd noticed that these people that were waiting on us in this really fancy, beautiful restaurant were in plain Jane clothes. Before the team was served their main course, Ross says, the owners came up and they said, I want to introduce you to the people that volunteered to help wait on you tonight. And all these townspeople got up and gave their testimonies. And they said that we helped save their lives, And I was just overwhelmed to see it in their eyes and to hear it in their voices. It was so moving that I had to get up and go compose myself, Ross says. That was my proudest moment. In prison for some pretty big mistakes, Ross found redemption in a small Wyoming town fighting wildfires. The townspeople were able to look beyond his mistakes, and finally, so was he. That was his proudest moment. Maybe this morning we can act as those townspeople for each other. Maybe we can see beyond each other's mistakes, and in doing so help to heal some of the wounds we carry from the hurts, embarrassments, and missteps of our past. May we learn to see the divine in ordinary miracles and even in the awkward mistakes. May we work at moving beyond our mistakes, using all that we have learned from them to help us on our journey. May we begin to see every moment as an opportunity for a do-over. May we be blessed with 1,000,000 mulligans, because spirits are not like beans, thank God. They may shrivel with neglect, but as long as life persists, there is the chance to wash off the polish and redeem the growing thing inside. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.